The Mind's Eye with BJ Turnoff. It's available on iTunes, Pandora, Amazon, all major platforms. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the Mind's Eye. You're standing at the intersection of history and mystery, the center of science and the strange, and your source for the subliminal to the criminal. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, host of this auditorium of audacity. Well, we got another one for you where we're gonna rewrite the history books, particularly on the foundation or in the formation of America. That crap we learned in school. It's just that, really. Tonight you're gonna hear about the real bloody struggle between the frontiersmen and Native Americans. Both the real and ideological battle between the two. It was much more brutal, gorier, and more horrific than really we could ever imagine. We're going to have two guides for this episode. Journalist and best-selling author Bob Drury. He's going to use legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone as our pathfinder through the narrative. What you're going to hear tonight, this is not like the coon skin cap wearing caricature of pop culture. This is the flesh, the blood, the frontiersman and the Revolutionary War hero. This also isn't going to be your stereotypical pop culture infused depictions of the indigenous people. This is going to be a real inclusive conversation. You've heard it a million times. History is written by the winners. But for this one, you're going to hear both the winners and the losers, so to speak. I mean, if you think that's quote-unquote woke, then, well, maybe you should wake up a little bit. And on the other side of the pendulum, if you think I'm just going to depict all Europeans of that time as conquering genocidal maniacs, I don't necessarily live in that black and white world because I know that there were some gray areas there. So that's part of what we're going to talk about. All the information we're going to talk about tonight is featured in Bob's book, Blood and Treasure, where he talked about all the real bloody battles, the violent conflicts between the Native Americans, the tribes whose lands the Europeans coveted highly, and that's, obviously a understatement of the year. But I've been posting excerpts from the book Blood and Treasure all week on Facebook and Twitter, leading up to the show tonight, the premiere. If you want to read a little bit more about it, go to our website where I got links to the social media, themindseyemedia.com. And, while you're there, I got tons of free content for you. Blogs, new and old, hand-selected news articles that I read throughout the week and I think are pretty interesting to post. And, of course, over 120 plus free episodes. If you like what you hear tonight or on previous episodes, enjoy what you read on the website, want to help me cover some of the costs to help run this little podcast, please hit that donate button at the top of themindseyemedia.com. Supporting your local podcast like The Mind's Eye. I mean, you really don't know how much that someone like me appreciates that, and thank you for doing that. Everyone who donates, no matter how big or small, and depending on what you donate, you can get anything from free episodes that have never been aired to free books on some of the previous people that we've interviewed. So, again, hit that donate button at the top. I really appreciate that. So now that we got that out of the way, let's bring on our guest, Bob Drury, New York Times bestselling author and military correspondent, author of 9 books and counting. Bob has been nominated for 3 National Magazine Awards and a Pulitzer. He's reported from Iraq, Afghanistan, Liberia, Bosnia, just to name a few. And now he reports from this humble podcast, The Mind's Eye. Bob, I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, Brian, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate you.
Well, feelings quite mutual. Let's get right into it. Let's talk about the new book, Blood and Treasure, Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's First Frontier. I'm about 2/3 of the way done, so once we're done with this interview, I'm going to go finish it up. I'm really enjoying it so far. It's got everything: bloodshed, betrayal, love, hate, everything in between, so I'm enjoying it, and I can't wait to finish it. Like I said, give readers and give future readers and listeners just a quick synopsis.
Well, let me start out, Brian, by just dispelling the man in our subtitle, Daniel Boone in the Fight for America's First Frontier. Let me dispel 2 myths about him. One, he did not die at the Alamo. So many people think that was Davy Crockett.
Right.
2, Daniel Boone hated coonskin caps. Also Davy Crockett. Boone was he was average height for his era. He's 5'7", 5'8". But all his cousins on his mother's Welsh side were giants for the era, 6'1", 6'2", 6'3". And Boone always thought he was short. And so he wouldn't wear a coonskin cap to bet on it. He always wore a tall hunter's hat. And, well, let me see. Where do I start? Okay, so here's something. It's not so much dispelling a myth, but you might find this interesting, even though, as I mentioned, he is in our subtitle. When my co-author Tom Clavin and I first had the germ of an idea for this book, Daniel Boone was completely off our radar. We wanted to, and we hope we have, written a biography not of Daniel Boone, but a biography of an era, a bloody era. There's the blood, and the treasure is the land that everyone was fighting for. And we had hoped to be able to tell the story of this era through the eyes of a Native American. I mean, it works so well for us in The Heart of Everything That Is, our book about Red Cloud, this Dakota war leader, the only Indian to ever win a war against the United States. So as we started digging into the research, and it's contemporaneous research, the closer you are to the times we have found in all our books, the more real it is, the more accurate it is. So when we started off with our contemporaneous research, we looked at Pontiac, the Ottawa chieftain. We looked at Tecumseh, the Shawnee. We even looked at Frenchmen and Englishmen because they were quite prevalent throughout this whole, say, 50-year period. And there was just no one that stood the test of time. Yet the further we got into it, the more we realized that Daniel Boone or his family was like the Zelig of this era, or for your younger listeners, the Forrest Gump of this era. Whenever something was going on, there was a Boone there. When William Penn, the colonial governor of Pennsylvania, tried to, unlike every other colonial governor, tried to deal somewhat fairly with the indigenous peoples, the American Indians, there was George Boone, Daniel's grandfather, standing by his side, another Quaker. When the Americans, or the Euro-Americans, started to make small inroads into what was then the wilderness down in the Virginia Shenandoah Valley and North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains, there was Daniel's father, Squire Boone, leading one of the first wagon trains, with 16-year-old Daniel, by the way, being the chief hunter for the wagon train. He already at that young age, he was a marksman. He knew the forest, and every night he would go out and he would bring in game for the entire wagon train. During the French and Indian War, General Braddock's failed march into the interior to try to dislodge the French from what was then Fort Duquesne, became Fort Pitt, and of course is now Pittsburgh. There was Daniel Boone. He was a teamster. And when Braddock's army was destroyed, Boone barely escaped with his life alongside the 23-year-old militia commander. Boone was 20, and George Washington was a 23-year-old militia commander. When the Cumberland Gap afforded a break in the Appalachian Mountains, or as they say down there, the Appalachians, there was Daniel Boone leading the first Easterners through that gap in the mountains. And when the Western Front of the American Revolution, this kind of surprised us. Of all the myths that sprung up about Daniel Boone, I can't believe that his crucial role in the Western Front of the American Revolution kind of got lost in the wash. But anyway, this is just a long-winded way of telling you that everywhere we looked, there was Daniel Boone. So we finally decided, listen, if we're going to have someone guide us through this era, it's got to be Boone. And that's how we decided upon it.
Yeah, I really appreciated how you, obviously Daniel Boone is a large part of it, but that you also, the Native American experience and talking about what happened to them is just as big an integral part of the book. And so I think our conversation is probably going to be kind of split in three ways. One where we talk a lot about the Native American experience, one with Daniel Boone, and then how it kind of combines. So I think let's start with, I guess, where the fact that, like you mentioned or alluded to before, history is written by the winner. So I really appreciated how much you talked about the Native American experience and the Anglo-American one, obviously. And if you look at today's, American history books, it still completely undersells the immense population, the diversity, of the indigenous people before the Europeans came in, before they came. So, as pointed out in the book, 90% or 9 million indigenous people perished with the onslaught of Europeans taking land. Do you think America has fully atoned for those sins yet, or there's still left to be done?
I think there's a lot left to be done, although I don't know what actually can be done. I mean, I just saw, I'm not sure if it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, where the former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum made a statement, which he's getting a lot of grief for, saying there was nothing here. Right. There was nothing here before the Europeans landed. And one of my favorite historians, Francis Jennings, the way he put it was the Europeans did not conquer wilderness. They conquered Indians. Right. They did not discover America. They invaded it. And could it have been any different? I don't think so. That's the treasure, if you will, in our title, Blood and Treasure. The treasure was the land, and also, early on, the deer skins, the beaver pelts. I mean, these were both Britain and France, before the American Revolution, both Britain and France were fighting over this land for the bounty that it provided. I mean, this was a gold mine west of the Appalachians. And it's one of the reasons, as you well know, you're reading the book, that the British didn't want the Americans, the nascent Americans, over the Appalachians. They wanted to keep that country pristine. If it meant dealing with the American Indian tribes, fine. They would trade them. Some, of course, muskets and ammunition, but also trinkets, blankets, beads, steel knives, steel pots. This was the breadbasket of the British Empire, the burgeoning British Empire at the time. And that's the treasure of our title, Blood and Treasure. Of course, the blood, and you mentioned this in your introduction, Tom and I were under no illusions about how violent the birth of this nation was. I mean, the carnage, the whirlwind of carnage just... Brian, you probably don't know this, but I was a war correspondent for 20 years, and I spent time in hellholes. I was in Afghanistan. I took a bullet in Afghanistan. I was in Iraq. I was in Darfur. I took shrapnel in Sarajevo, and I've seen some ugly things. But the more we delved into the research of the butcher's bill on both sides for the conquering, but for what were the kind of the nascent stirrings of manifest destiny, even though the phrase was not coined for another half century. For we want the land, we want the deer, we want the buffalo. Believe it or not, that's another thing that surprised me. I didn't realize there were buffalo roaming east of the Mississippi River. This was a land rich in arable land, in rivers, in fish, in animals, and the Indians were not going to give it up without a fight. I mean, there's a reason. Once again, we're back to Boone. I guess we're intertwining him a little bit. There's a reason the book opens with Daniel Boone's oldest son, his 16-year-old son, James, bleeding out, gut shot, in Indian ambush, a combined war party of Cherokee, Shawnee, and Delaware. And as he is dying, the leader of the war party, an Indian whose anglicized name was Big Jim, is just gratuitously plucking out his fingernails and his toenails. And then the book sort of ends years and years later with Daniel Boone's son Israel dying in Daniel's arms, an Indian musket ball lodged in his heart, and gouts of blood spewing out of his mouth as he tries to tell his father, "I love you." I mean, this was... And if I can, once again, the butcher's bill went both sides. For every white infant scalped by a raiding party, for every white militiaman made to dance while his fingers and then hands and then the rest of his limbs were lopped off and he was thrown into a bonfire, for every Revolutionary War soldier who was burned at the stake, the white interlopers were just as vicious. I mean, they would fall on peaceful Indian villages and kill every man, woman, and child. They would hang Indian scalps. I mean, and we're not just talking Americans, too. It goes back. I mean, there was Jeffrey Amherst, who was the British Governor General of the colonies at the time. During Pontiac's rebellion, he called he knew it wasn't going to go anywhere, but he asked for a fake peace delegation of Ottawas to meet him at Fort Pitt. It didn't go anywhere, just as he suspected. And on their way out, he gifted them with blankets, which had purposely been infected with smallpox. Vermin for vermin, he called it. I mean, you got the Spanish down in the Floridas, West Florida and East Florida, running down the Seminoles with packs of bloodhounds. And then when they had them cornered, releasing these Irish wolfhounds to tear them apart. So the carnage went both ways. I'm not putting the onus on either race, white race or red race. And it was almost inevitable. I mean, when you have the early Puritan preacher, Cotton Mather, fulminating from the pulpit in Boston about wiping out the red sons of Satan, and even such luminaries as Thomas Jefferson putting forth a proposal to destroy the Indian race between the Atlantic and the Mississippi, it's only natural that the Indians were going to respond with due violent measures, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you open up the part 3 of a book with a quote from Thomas Jefferson saying, I think the most important object which we can be proposed would be the extermination of those hostile tribes of Indians. Yeah. Now, was that like a straight racist thing, or was he just really referencing the tribes that were against him because there were some tribes that also worked with them?
I think it was a straight racist thing. Actually, there weren't a lot of tribes that worked with the Americans. The Indians were, first of all, during the French and Indian War, they saw what was going on. They weren't stupid. And let's pick a side that we hate less. We hate the French less, so let's fight with the French. Then during the American Revolution, okay, it's the Americans versus the English. Let's see. Any indigenous tribe that kind of sat it out, so to speak, was more or less of the mind, let these white bastards kill each other. And anyone who usually joined with the English on the theory that, okay, the English need this breadbasket. They need these deerskins. They need these beaver pelts. They will probably treat us not worse than the Americans who want our land. And land was, and of course, even to this day, I'm of Irish heritage. You furrow the land. You get milk cows, or out west you get a cattle ranch. Whereas the Indians saw the land as a much more spiritual kind of thing, and the white race would just desecrate the land with fences and with plowed fields, and they'd cut down forests, and I mean, even to the little things. I mean, the buffalo that did roam, the white hunters that killed the buffalo would cut off their hump because it was a delectable. It was a mixture of fat and lean meat, and it was apparently very delicious. And also the shanks, the bone marrow. And then they would just leave the rest of the animal to die. I mean, to die. The animal was already dead. They would just leave the rest of the animal.
Yeah, the carcass.
In the forest. It would be the same thing with deer. They'd take the skin and leave the deer. And because, believe it or not, deer meat wasn't considered good meat. The white hunters would much rather eat possum or raccoon. And the Indians saw this just as a desecration of the natural relationship between nature and man. And it was never going to end well for the Indians, despite, there's a good segue, despite Daniel Boone's empathy for the Indians. Brian, it's funny. Boone went to his grave, and he lived to the ripe old age of 85, which was an anomaly for the era. He died in 1820. He went to his grave. By this time, he was rather famous as America's Pathfinder, detesting the fact that he was also known as America's premier Indian fighter. He didn't have anything against the Indians. Now, granted, he fought in many wars against the Indians, and he killed many Indians, but that was in war. He never murdered an Indian.
Yeah, if anything, he had great respect for them and affinity. I think affinity for them. I think 5 years after his son's murder, wasn't he adopted into a tribe?
Yeah, well, he was captured, and then when he was adopted, you're hitting on something here. He was a man of his time, and then of course he fought in these wars that you and I have never heard. Lord Dunmore's War, the Cherokee Wars. But on the other hand, he also understood the Indian respect for the land, and he a perfect example. I mentioned before Cotton Mather preaching against the red sons of Satan. Towards the end of his life, Daniel Boone, his first biographer, a school teacher named John Filson, He told Filson, listen, I'm not much of a religious man, but I have as much respect and esteem for the Indian's great spirit as I do for any Christian God. I mean, that would pretty much make him an apostate in any church on the East Coast. So he was a man of his time, but he was also a man out of his time, where he hoped against hope, perhaps naively, that somehow the white race and the red race can make some kind of accommodation. The word's great coming out of my mouth now in the 21st century, but at one point he told Filson, if only we could make the Indians more white. And what he meant by that is if we could turn them from hunter-gatherers into farmers and cattle herders, if we could teach them how to use a loom. He perhaps, once again naively, he wanted to make some accommodation with the tribes. And in that sense, white men like Daniel Boone with an attitude like that towards the indigenous people were few and far between.
Let's kind of keep taking that break from a lot of the violence that we're going to come back to, because, I mean, not everybody did treat indigenous people poorly. Then someone like William Penn, as pointed out, was that, who Pennsylvania is named after, he made it a point to treat them like any other resident. I mean, what would someone else today find kind of surprising between the relationship between natives and Europeans at the time?
Well, it started out well. When the first Europeans first set foot on this fatal shore, the Delaware in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Maryland, they were willing to accommodate them. Sure, we got plenty of space. Where do you want to live? The Cherokee in the South, they actually in the 1730s, they sent a delegation to London saying, yes, we will work with you. We have plenty of land. We'll share it with you. But as it became more and more apparent that the white man was not going to settle for what the Native American was willing to give, that's when blood just erupted from a dragging canoe, an Indian you'd never heard of, and I had never heard of him before writing this book, a Cherokee. Kentucky was at kind of the center of this, because you had the old Northwest Territory above and to the west in Kentucky, when that would be Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, of course, parts of Wisconsin. And then below Kentucky, you had the Cherokee lands of what are now Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. So Kentucky was at the center of this, and of course Boone was also. And once the Indians realized they're not settling, they want it all. They're not willing to make a deal with us. I mean, you mentioned William Penn. We write about the Great Walking Treaty, where in the Delaware at the time in Pennsylvania, which is now eastern Pennsylvania, but at the time was the borderlands of Pennsylvania, the white men said, listen, we will give you European-made goods. And, of course, the Indians wanted this. They wanted muskets. They wanted steel pots and the trinkets, the mirrors. They wanted that stuff. So William Penn said, here, we'll give you all this. And he laid out what he was going to give them. If you give us enough land for that a man can walk in 24 hours. And he said, sure, that's a good deal. We have plenty of land. And as it turns out, Penn had assembled runners, the best runners in the colony of Pennsylvania. And when the starting gun fired, so to speak, the Indians were under the impression that, okay, a guy was going to walk, and these white men were going to walk, and however far they got, that's their land. These runners ran northeast, southwest as fast as they could, kind of like a relay race. And the Indians never forgot how they had been tricked. In fact, once the Delaware were pushed over the Alleghenies, and their shamans would tell tales of, oh yes, the white man will come and he will take a cane chair and he will say, we just want as much land as this cane chair will fit. And the Delaware said, yes, you may have that much land. And then the white man would unravel the cane until it was no more than a string you could barely see that would stretch over the horizon. In other words, the Indians knew. At first they were naive, as Boone was, I suppose, in thinking that there could be some accommodation reached. But they soon came to realize that the European Americans and later the Americans, they were just insatiable.
you hear a lot about the Trail of Tears, but you don't hear a lot about like these deceitful agreements that they had, like the Walking Purchase that preceded that, and really kind of set the tone for those type of relationships and the bloody acts that were going to follow in, you know, the French and Indian War, which is probably maybe one of the most barbaric wars in recent history. So, and as you kind of alluded to before that, I mean, that was really like one of the first examples of germ warfare, right?
Yes, that was one. The Henry Bouquet, who actually was the second in command, who gave the Ottawa delegation the purposely infected blanket, he had also been involved 6 years earlier in the Cherokee Wars, and the Cherokee were decimated by a smallpox epidemic. And to this day, historians cannot prove it, but they think that this Swiss mercenary working for the English, Henry Bouquet, probably introduced the first germ warfare into the North American continent.
You have a really poetic way in the book of talking about some pretty horrible things. I think my favorite quote from the book so far is, at least, great blood-drenched events often turn on small hinges. And you see that splattered throughout the whole book. I mean, what is one example from the book that you could talk about for that quote?
You just mentioned the springboard for came to be known as Lord Dunmore's War. Lord Dunmore was the colonial governor of Virginia. There was a small Seneca tribe living kind of under the Aegis. They were allied with, there was only 600, well, they were called Mingos because of a quirk in the Mingwawe, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, meant southernmost of the Iroquois Confederation. So the whites knew them as Mingos. And I think I wrote about when you said small hinged, Helen of Troy, crossing the Rubicon. And so the Mingos had an orator, a war leader named, his Americanized name was Logan, John Logan, but everybody knew him as Logan. And at one point, these Virginia mercenaries descended on a backwoods tavern, a trading post not far from the Mingo settlement, and they sent out an emissary saying, we want to have a peace talk with Logan. Logan was off talking to other Indians to the west, but Logan's pregnant wife, his brother, his son, his daughter, his cousin, and of course a small coterie, a Praetorian guard of Mingos came, and they arrived at this trading post, and suddenly, in the middle of, the man who ran the trading post made sure he served lots of liquor. And when the Indians were drunk enough, the Virginia mercenaries burst out from a back room, and they massacred men, women, and children. And at one point, when Logan's wife, pregnant wife, when she's lying dead, they slit open her abdomen, plucked the boy out of her womb, scalped the boy, and then impaled him on a stake. I mean, that's the kind of violence that we're talking about. I mean, it blows our mind, but then again, I just saw yesterday that a woman. I watched a video of a woman being whipped in Afghanistan for using a telephone. So maybe I'm the one who's naive.
I guess I think one of the facts that blew my mind when I was reading was how Earth scientists pointed out that the decimation of the indigenous populations prompted an actual worldwide climate effect.
Right. It was the Little Ice Age, because but the Indians, people forget, they cleared land. The Three Sisters, they planted crops, and as they slowly but surely, or actually not so slowly, as they quickly but surely began to be wiped out, their lands overgrew with eastern timberland, and that planted, and that, because it changed the oxygen level in the atmosphere and the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere, and it prompted a 200-year little ice age where the Thames froze. The Dutch, Hans Brinker and his Silver Skates, the canals have never frozen before that or after that in the Netherlands. I mean, there were ice storms and orange groves in China. Timbuktu in Africa was frozen over. And I don't know, maybe I'm glad. Yeah, Brian, thank you for bringing that up, because I always thought that was just me that liked that corny, crazy stuff like that.
No. There were so many tidbits in there that were not necessarily, they were related, but not necessarily relevant, but they were just like another one was how I didn't realize this, that actually the word, buck, the slang for buck, a dollar, comes from that time. The honeybees weren't in America until European settlers came here. And what was one of your favorite ones that you picked up along the way?
You know what you just said, but that's when I give presentations, I said, anybody got a dollar bill in their pocket? What is it? It's called, and somebody will have it. Yeah, I got a buck. A buck came from a male deer. Oh, his skin was worth, at the time, Spanish pesos were circulating in the backwoods on the west side, on the lee side of the I guess it's not the lee side, the east side would be the lee side, on the west side of the Appalachians, Spanish pesos. And they were worth what German long hunters would call a thaler. And that thaler eventually became our dollar. And our dollar was worth one buckskin. So the dollar became a buck. I love stuff like that. I love stuff like that. Anybody got a buck? Oh, you got a whole buckskin in your wallet, do you? So
I think one that I got from actually your co-author, Tom Clavin, from last year's interview with him on Tombstone was that, riding shotgun. That was, came from that time frame. So, I love those little things. And that one there was a ton of those. So I really appreciated that you obviously had those included too.
Sometimes I think I'm just justifying myself because I like it. So to hear someone like you bring up the buck, and the little ice age, it gratifies me. Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. No, I love those little conversation pieces, and obviously most of that's pretty horrible, but still they spark conversation nonetheless. But obviously we've talked a lot about some pretty horrible things, bloody things, but there were a lot of tender moments in the book. I mean, one, for example, let's get back, I guess to our protagonist of sorts, Daniel Boone, that the relationship between him and his wife. I mean, there was one moment that I remember where they both admit to actually cheating on each other, and then you describe it as just a typical Boone moment. I mean, how does that epitomize the man, that relationship, and that moment?
His equanimity comes through in the contemporaneous research. The incident you're speaking about, he was all fighting with the North Carolina militia. This is before he made any inroads into Kentucky. He was all fighting with the North Carolina militia in the Cherokee Wars. And he was gone for maybe 11, 12 months. And on the way back, he had never seen eastern Tennessee. This is, once again, we're still in the east face of the Appalachians. And he asked his commander's permission to explore and hunt a little. And so by the time he got home, it was 16 months later. And he walked into the cabin in the Yadkin Valley in the Blue Ridge that he shared with his wife of 56 years, I might add, Rebecca. And Rebecca is nursing a baby daughter, an infant daughter. And I think one of Boone's biographers described him as a lettered, if not a learned man. And he could do arithmetic. And he realized, I've been gone for 16 months. This is not my daughter. So when he said to Rebecca, he said, Rebecca, what's the paternity? Who's the father of this? And Rebecca very forthrightly said, listen, I thought you were dead. The rest of the army returned from the Cherokee Wars. You did not. And I'm a mother. I already had 2 young children. I'm on the borderlands. I'm a single mother. And your younger brother, Nettie, who by all accounts could have passed for Daniel's twin. They look so much alike. He gave me sucre. He comforted me. Daniel, I'm sorry, one thing led to another. And here we have our baby daughter, Jemima. So Daniel kind of, scratched his chin and finally confessed. I married a flesh and blood woman. I did not marry a portrait of a saint. And he confessed to his dalliances on his long hunts with Indian maidens. And finally, he just looked at Rebecca and he said, Nettie, huh? So much the better. It's all in the family. And I just love that about him. I mean, you talk about equanimity. And he treated Jemima as his daughter for the rest of his life and her life. In fact, he died on Jemima's farm in Mississippi. And he never held it against Nettie that he had fathered an infant with his wife. In fact, And that baby daughter was, when she was 13, she was 11. She was kidnapped by a combined Cherokee-Shawnee war party, a small one. And Daniel Boone led the search, the 3-day search on foot, running the entire way. And he finally ambushed. The Indians thought they were out of Boone's range, and they stopped to make a fire after they killed a buffalo. And Boone led the ambush that retrieved his daughter and 2 other little girls. And 40 years later, of course, that became James Fenimore Cooper's set piece in The Last of the Mohicans. What we would call today ripping something from the headlines and writing a book about it. That's what Fenimore Cooper did with the Daniel Boone story, which became very well known up and down the colonies.
Yeah, the law and order of its time, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Reading about some of the women in the book, I mean, you think to yourself, wow, I mean, these women are hard. I mean, harder than me, for sure, and harder than I'd probably say most modern men. I mean, we know the importance of, women in Native American tribes because, it's a matriarchal society. But, I mean, would you agree that women of that time, during that time period, really their roles are maybe a little bit misunderstood today?
Well, when you have to haul water, chop wood, maintain the truck garden out back, not only to eat, but maybe to sell off some of the crops you're growing to help pay the taxes on your property and raise a family at the same time, while your husband, a guy like Daniel Boone, is traipsing around hunting for the 12, 13 months. Yeah, I would say that they're probably tougher than me and you combined.
Yeah, and their experience was just one of many. I mean, Boone his restless nature was the quintessential American of the time, always roaming. And when they're roaming, like you said, who are they leaving behind? The women, exactly. So they have everything to do.
That's another thing about Boone, too. When he was young, even preteen, when his grandfather and father were living on what were then the Pennsylvania borderlands, there would be these Indian white trade fairs. And the 10, 11, 12-year-old Boone, he would observe the Indians. He had a keen, curious eye. And even then, what are we talking about, the 1740s? Even then, the phrase, walks as straight as an Indian, was in vogue. And Boone, young Boone, he would watch these Indians and not only marvel over their weapons, he was always a weapons guy, but watch the way they learned. They actually taught him certain milkweeds. If you chewed them up and applied a berry, it was good for snake bites. There was a certain tree bark that would help stop the infection from a gunshot wound. He learned in that sense, the way the Indians communed with their natural world. But one of the things that kind of shocked him as a young boy was the way that the headmen, whether they were war leaders or peace leaders, would consult with their elder female tribe mates about where to make camp, when to go on a hunt, when to perform a religious ceremony. And to Boone, this was another world. I mean, even the Quakers, they never consulted with women. It was a man's world. And yet he saw that there was something to the indigenous people that went beyond the life that he had been living, and that stayed with him for the rest of his life.
Yeah, the title really is doesn't really it only shows you like a peek into really what the book about, because it really does capture those moments in history and how they are so important, the big and the little ones, and it really captures how that the conflict between the Native Americans and the Europeans, and how that was really the formation of the country and started where we are today. And that, in a sense, that fight was, it just really wasn't over land, not just the treasure, but it was also existential and ideological battle.
Good way to put it.
And I don't know if this is like a great analogy, but to me, I see a lot of parallels between the Palestinian and Israeli conflict to the European and Native American one, because it was more than just land. It was, ideological as well. I mean, what parallels do you see today from that time?
Well, the Israel leaders, they constantly throw the indigenous people thing in our face. Say, why are you defending the Palestinians when you did the same thing to the Indian tribes? I mean, I suppose if you're a Hobbesian and, nature red in tooth and claw, it's the way it is. To the victor go the spoils, to the victor go the land, and to the loser goes the grave. I mean, early on, when people were afraid to cross the Appalachians, it was, there are wolves, there are bears, there are snakes, there are semi-human beings with a red skin whose language is some kind of guttural grunt barely above the apes. If any one of these beings were to catch you, you are dead. And that's how, mothers used to say, the Shawnee were so feared that mothers used to tell their children, if you don't go to sleep, the Shawnee will get you. So that's how you dehumanize people from around the world. Like I said, I've seen it. I've seen it in the Mideast. I've seen it in South Asia. I've seen it in my parents' home country. And unfortunately, I'm not cynical, but I'm skeptical. And I'm skeptical that things are never going to change, whether it's on the Ukraine-Russia border right now, or whether, you know what, we're veering far afield from Blood and Treasure, but you're making me sad, Brian. Come on, stop this.
One thing that you pointed out, one thing that was in the book is that how you were talking, I think one map said, "Here be dragons," but that's just a really another way of phrasing a racist statement. So I think one thing that I took away from the book, at least one big lesson, is that because you were inclusive in how you looked at all the perspective, is that today we need to be really careful on how we look at history, particularly without proper context and inclusion of all perspectives.
I'll give you a perfect example right now. And the Treaty of 1868, known as the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Black Hills were ceded to the Dakota Sioux. And of course, several years later, Custer led a expedition in there. They found gold, and we just took the Black Hills. The United States government tried to offer the Sioux money. We'll take the Black Hills, and here's money. The Sioux refused to take it. To this day, they refuse to take it. That money has accrued in the U.S. Treasury. It's over $2 billion right now with interest. And the Sioux will not take that $2 billion. They want the Black Hills back. Now, of course, they're never going to get the Black Hills back.
Right, of course.
But
ideological. That's part of it.
Exactly.
Well, I know you sound, as you said, skeptical, but I, for one, am hopeful. I am seeing that we are more inclusive. We are recognizing more perspectives than ever. We are looking back at history and saying this was wrong, and where can we at least fix some things. So I'm hopeful, and I actually did get that from your book. So.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll end it on a good note.
Yeah, please.
I found out an hour before speaking to you that the book has been out for after 5 days. We are number 8 on the New York Times combined ebook and hardcover list, and we are number 10 on the New York Times bestseller list. So perhaps what you're saying is true. Perhaps people want to read about. I'm not saying we're re-educating anybody, but a different perspective. Let me put it that way.
Well, it's obviously striking a chord. So tell people where they can pick that up, and then, of course, feel free to promote any sites or projects else, other projects you got going on, Bob.
Oh, well, I'm old school, Brian. So I always like, if you could buy it at your local bookstore, I really would appreciate it. But I tell you what, I also got a kid who's talking about going to grad school. So if you want to buy it from Amazon or anywhere else, that's fine with me too. I could use the money.
Definitely do. Support your local bookstore. Support your local podcasts like The Mind's Eye here. Definitely check out Bob's book, Blood and Treasure, Daniel Boone in the Fight for America's First Frontier. Mr. Drury, I really appreciate your first slice of your time.
Brian, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
You probably noticed as well as that Bob was using words like the white and the red men. But, remember, he was using that in terms of the vocabulary and vernacular of the time period that we were talking about. That's not like his personal statement or anything like that. So just kind of wanted to clarify that just in case. But now that that's out of the way, next week we are going on a good old-fashioned treasure hunt. Dan and Teresa Duke returned to the show. Last year we talked about the evidence that they are the great-great-grandchildren of outlaw Jesse James, who faked his death and then lived into a ripe old age. There's a little bit more to that story too, because regardless if that is actually true or not, their real great-great-grandfather, whoever he was, did leave treasure maps behind. So on the next episode, Dan and Teresa will tell us how they decoded the maps and what they found. Until then, be well and let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff signing off from the Mind's Eye.